The cowboy rode out to hunt, but returned with a wounded Apache woman instead. The morning bit so hard the air felt like it burned your lungs. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Frost clung to the grass in shaded hollows, and a thin glaze of ice rimmed the puddles along the lower trail. Wade Cross was up before dawn, as was his habit, ready for another day that would look a lot like the ones before. He was 37, wiry from ranch work, and old scars, a face cut by lines that spoke of more than just years. His beard was cropped close, streaked with gray, though he wasn't an old man yet. His eyes were the color of a brewing storm, sharp, watchful, the sort that measured ground before you stepped on it. He stepped out from his cabin with a rifle slung over his shoulder and his hat pulled low against the chill. His boots cracked at the seams, but oiled crunched through frost as he followed a faint track into the pines. That rifle wasn't fashion. It was the difference between supper and an empty larder. Once a scout in the war, and before that a hand on long cattle drives, Wade knew how to live off what you could bring home. Venison, rabbit, turkey, whatever. Out this far, you couldn't count on the store in town. He'd lived near the New Mexico line long enough to know winters were lean. That's why he'd gone out in the pale light to put meat in the smokehouse to bank food against the hard weeks. He thought drifting how he'd wound up here. He'd had a wife once in Texas, a small place, and dreams of a family. Fever took her in days. He buried her beneath an oak and walked away from the land because the sight of it ate at him. Since then, he'd kept to himself a cabin in the foothills, enough land to scrape by. He spoke little, drank less, and only went to town when he had to. Folks didn't pry, and he gave them no reason to. The trail ahead marked blood, faint at first, then clearer the deeper he went. A dark streak on pine needles, a smear across a flat stone. He slowed, rifle ready, every sense wound tight. He expected a wounded buck or a coyote. His mind held to the work. Food for the shed, the smokehouse full a little margin for the weeks to come. He pushed through low brush branches scraping his coat and stepped into a small opening. What lay there stopped him cold. At first his mind, she looked young, maybe 24. Apache dark hair tangled with dirt and needles, braids threaded with beads that caught the light. Her deerskin dress was ripped bad. One seam run down a shoulder, the neckline torn wide enough to show the line of her chest to the cold. A split at the hip revealed the curve of her thigh where cloth had torn away. Her body wore bruises in different shades, some fresh, some older. Rope burns circled her wrists. Her chest rose in thin breaths that looked too shallow to keep her long. Wade froze, rifle still in his hands. Old instincts tightened his muscles. He'd been a soldier along the border and had seen Apache raids. He'd fought bled and watched comrades fall. That memory sat sharp in him. For a moment only, that memory moved his hand. The stock pressed to his shoulder finger, near the trigger. His breath fogged out slow, but then she opened her eyes, dark, steady, a mix of fear and iron pride. Her gaze locked on him and didn't flinch. She didn't beg or make a sound. Her breathing was strained but steady. She looked at him as if daring him to do what others might have done. In that look, something cut through his anger. He eased the rifle down slow and deliberate until the barrel pointed at the ground. He stood there, chest heaving, mind racing. He told himself he didn't know. Her story didn't know what she'd done. She could have been cast off escaped or left as bait. He weighed those chances risk against choice. But he also knew if he left her there, she'd be dead before the sun climbed. He crouched beside her boots, pressing the frosted pine needles. She flinched when his shadow fell over her, but didn't scramble away. He brushed back a layer of branches from her arm and took in her injuries more close. Rope, tight and long worn, marked her wrists. Bruises ran up her shoulder where hands had gripped hard. The dress hadn't simply torn from wear. It had been ripped, pulled as though in a fight. Wade's jaw tightened. It wasn't a sight he liked. He didn't have fond memories of Apaches from the war, but this wasn't warfare. It was something lower. He hesitated. He'd been alone long enough to know what bringing another person into his cabin meant questions risk. It meant the fragile balance he'd built from silence and routine would be broken. He could walk off and no one ever would know, but he didn't move. His eyes stayed on her face. Her breath was shallow. Her lips cracked. Dirt chilled her skin. "Damn it," he muttered low. He slid the rifle onto his back, slipped his arms under her carefully, and lifted. She was lighter than he'd expected. Her frame was strong, but hollowed by exhaustion. She tensed when Wade Cross gathered her up, yet there was no strength left to fight. Her breath came in quick, sharp bursts against his neck. He rose with her weight steady in his arms and turned toward the trail. Each step thudded with the weight of his choice. He wondered how she saw him, maybe just another enemy, another man who might hurt her. He thought of whoever had left her to die, and of the quiet cabin waiting ahead, knowing it would never feel the same once he carried her inside. Still, he kept moving. Frost cracked under his boots. The trees tightened around them, and somewhere a crow's cry echoed like a warning. Wade carried Ahyv Morning Star out of the clearing, not yet knowing what price the decision would bring, only sure he couldn't leave her in the dirt to die. By the time he reached the cabin, sunlight filtered through the pines, casting long, cold beams across patches of lingering frost. His arms burned from the long carry, but he held his jaw tight and his pace steady until the familiar shape of the cabin rose ahead. Smoke drifted light from the chimney. The fire inside still glowed from the coals he had banked at dawn. Shifting her gently, careful not to jar her, he nudged the door open with his boot. Hinges groaned as he stepped through. The single-room cabin was plain and solid, built of logs he'd cut himself. A narrow bed with a wool blanket and a folded quilt stood against one wall. A scarred table and 2 chairs sat near the window. Shelves along the far side held jars of beans, dried corn, a sack of flour, and a scatter of tools. A Winchester leaned ready by the wall. Wade lowered her onto the bed. She stirred slightly, her eyes flicking around the room like a cornered animal measuring a cage. Her chest rose too quickly, breath strained. He pulled the quilt over her, tucking it high enough to hide the tears in her dress. She shot him a wary glance, but didn't push the blanket away. He crossed to the hearth, fed a split log to the fire, and poured hot water into a tin cup. Crouching beside her, he held it out. Her hand rose slowly, trembling raw rope burns on her wrists. Her fingers brushed his as she took the cup and drank. Water spilled at the corner of her mouth, but she didn't waste a drop. "Got a name?" Wade asked quietly, more habit than hope. She studied him a long moment, then in halting English said, "Ahyv Morning Star." He gave a brief nod. Wade. Silence settled thick between them, broken only by the fire's crackle and the kettle's soft whistle. He turned to the shelves, fetched a tin of beans and the last heel of bread, and set the beans to warm. He thought about the supplies meant to last the week, but leaving her out there would weigh heavier than hunger. When the beans were ready, he set them on the table and split the bread in half. Carrying the food back, he crouched again and placed it within her reach. She eyed it, then him, suspicion still tight in her shoulders. Hunger finally won. She ate slowly, each swallow seeming to hurt. Beneath the torn dress, she was painfully thin. Her collarbones stood sharp. He asked quietly, though he didn't expect much. She glanced away before murmuring one word, chain. She touched her wrist, then a bruised shoulder. That single word told him enough. Someone had bound and used her, maybe traded her, and thought she wouldn't survive. His jaw hardened as he stood. He'd seen men commit worse during the war, and still wished he could forget. While she ate, he fetched a small tin of salve and a strip of clean cloth. Sitting on the bed's edge, he reached for her arm. She stiffened, every muscle ready to bolt. He paused until her eyes met his. "Just to clean it," he said, voice low and steady. Slowly, she let her arm relax. He dabbed the raw skin, wrapped it carefully, and tied it off. She flinched once, but didn't resist. He treated the other wrist the same, then put the tin away. Morning stretched on. Wade moved through his chores, checking the rifle, splitting logs, stacking wood, aware of her watchful gaze. He knew what she saw, a man scarred by years of silence and rough living, and when he looked back, he saw a woman who had endured more than most men could imagine. Questions pressed at him, who had left her, how close they might be, whether they would come hunting. But he had already made his choice. There was no turning back. If men came knocking, Wade Cross already knew what he'd tell them. By noon, Ahyv Morning Star had drifted into sleep beneath the quilt, her face turned toward the fire's steady glow. Wade sat at the table, honing his knife on a whetstone, slow and methodical. From time to time, his eyes slid to her, taking in every rise of her breath. None of this had been in the plan. He'd set out at dawn only to bring back meat for winter. Yet here he was, sheltering a stranger who carried danger and something else he hadn't felt in years. The cabin, once steeped in silence, no longer felt empty. When she stirred awake, she murmured words in her own tongue he couldn't grasp. Then her dark eyes fixed on him. "No, kill me," she said softly, broken English, but clear. Wade laid the knife aside and leaned in, voice calm and steady. "Ain't here for that." She searched his face, testing for a crack in his words. Finding none, she eased back on the pillow, her breathing loosening. For the first time in years, Wade sensed the rhythm of his day shift. He didn't know where this road would lead, only that he hadn't carried her out of the woods to watch her die under his roof. Next morning, cold seeped thin through the log walls. Wade rose from the chair by the hearth where he'd dozed, boots still on, rifle within reach. He stretched the stiffness from his shoulders, rubbed a hand across his beard, and looked toward the bed. Ahyv Morning Star lay awake, eyes tracing the beams overhead. The quilt still wrapped her high, dark hair, spilling loose beads tangled in the strands. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet had weight. He poured warm water from the kettle into a basin and set it on the table. "You need to wash," he said low, gesturing the motion when words might fail. Her gaze followed his, then settled on the basin. She gave a small nod. Wade left a cloth on the table and stepped outside to give her room. The morning air bit sharp. He scanned the timberline and the slope below, mind turning over questions. Men cruel enough to chain a woman like her didn't simply forget. If they came hunting, he'd hear the hooves soon enough, and he knew exactly how he'd meet them. It wasn't just his life on the line anymore. When he returned, she still sat by the bed, face damp where she'd washed. The torn dress clung to her seams, gaping. Shame flickered in her eyes when she caught him looking. Without a word, Wade crossed to the trunk, pulled out a clean shirt of his own, and set it on the bed. "Wear this," he said. She glanced from the shirt to him, lips parting as if to question, but only nodded. While she changed beneath the quilt, He turned his back and fed the hearth-breaking kindling and stirring last night's beans. When he looked again, she wore his shirt over the dress sleeves hanging past her wrists, but decently covering her. She sat a little taller, less exposed. "Better," he said quietly. She gave a small nod. Later, when he set food on the table, she rose carefully. Her legs shook, one hand clutching the bedpost. Wade stepped in, catching her by the waist before she fell. She startled, breath sharp, but didn't pull away. He steadied her, feeling the tremor in her muscles. Their eyes met close now, her face pale from the effort. Neither moved for a heartbeat. Then he guided her gently to the chair. She eased into it, breathing hard but upright. He set a plate of beans and bread in front of her. She ate with more strength, less hesitation, though her gaze kept darting to him. Wade sat opposite, chewing slow thoughts running steady. "Where from?" he asked bluntly, testing what she understood. She touched her chest lightly. "Ahyv Morning Star?" "My people far," she said, motioning west. Then she rubbed the scarred wrist and shook her head. "Not go back. That was all. It was enough." Wade didn't press. He knew the weight of having nowhere to return. When she finished, she tried standing again, this time aiming for the hearth. Her steps wavered, but she reached the stool and lowered herself with care. She held her hands near the fire, letting the warmth sink in. Wade worked in silence, then stepped outside with the axe. Each swing rang steady across the clearing. He stacked split logs against the wall, mind circling the same truth he had brought her here, and now she was part of his days, whether he welcomed it or not. Inside, he found her studying the shelves, dark eyes moving over jars and sacks. She touched a jar of beans, then looked at him. "You alone?" "Yeah," he answered simply. She pointed at herself, then at him. "Now, too." The broken words landed deeper than he expected. He gave a slow, quiet nod. That evening, Ahyv Morning Star tried pacing the cabin end to end, testing the strength in her legs. When she wavered, Wade Cross stepped in steady hands, bracing her side. She looked up, meeting his eyes close, and though her body shook, she didn't pull away. He guided her back to the bed and drew the quilt over her again. Then he moved to the table, working the edge of his knife along a whetstone while the fire snapped and hissed. From the bed, she watched him, eyes heavy but still fierce. At last her voice came soft, carrying a question he hadn't seen coming. "Why? Help me?" Wade set the knife down and met her gaze. "Didn't want to see you die out there," he said simply. She searched his face, as if weighing the truth behind every word, then closed her eyes, breath easing into sleep. Wade leaned back in his chair, staring into the flames. His mind roamed the days ahead, the dangers that might ride out of the timber, the cabin that no longer felt solely his. The quiet inside was heavier now, yet far from empty. He'd crossed a line the moment he carried her inside. There was no turning back. Next morning, cold air threaded through the log walls. Wade roused from the chair by the hearth, where he'd dozed with boots still on one hand, never far from the rifle beside him. Stretching out the stiffness, he scrubbed a hand across his beard and glanced toward the bed. Ahyv Morning Star was awake, eyes fixed on the rafters. The quilt still wrapped her snug black hair scattered across the pillow beads caught in the strands. For a time neither spoke, but the silence carried weight. Wade poured hot water from the kettle into a basin and set it on the table. "You need to wash," he said, voice low. She might not catch every word, so he mimed the motion. Her eyes followed, then shifted to the basin. She gave a small nod. He laid a folded cloth on the table's edge and stepped outside, giving her privacy. The morning air bit sharp as he breathed it in, eyes sweeping the tree line and slope below. Questions crowded his thoughts. Men who chained a woman like her didn't just let her vanish. Would they ride up the trail at dawn? If they did, he knew what he'd do. He'd fought men before, and could again. Only now, it wasn't just his life at stake. When he returned, she sat by the bed, the basin beside her face, damp from washing. The torn dress clung to her frame. No matter how she tugged at it, the seams still gaped. Catching his glance, shame flickered across her face. Without a word, Wade crossed to the trunk, drew out a clean shirt of his own, and set it on the bed. "Wear this," he said. She looked at the shirt, then at him, lips parting as if to question, but she only nodded. While she changed beneath the quilt, he turned his back, breaking kindling and stirring last night's beans. When he looked again, she had pulled on the shirt sleeves long over her wrists, covering what the dress could not. She sat a little straighter, less exposed. "Better," Wade said quietly. A faint nod answered him. Later, as he set food on the table, she rose carefully. Her legs shook, one hand gripping the bedpost. Wade stepped to her side, catching her by the waist before she could fall. The sudden contact startled her. Her breath hitched, but she didn't draw away. He steadied her, feeling the tremor in her muscles. Their eyes met close enough for him to see the effort in her pale face. For a long moment, neither moved. Then he guided her to a chair at the table. She eased into it, breathing hard but upright. He placed a plate of beans and bread before her. This time she ate with more strength, less hesitation, though her gaze kept flicking to him, watchful. He sat across from her, chewing slowly, thoughts steady. "Where from?" he asked, words blunt. Her brow tightened. She touched her chest lightly. "Ahyv Morning Star. My people far," she said, motioning west. Then she rubbed the scarred wrist and shook her head. Not go back. That was all she offered, and it was enough. Wade didn't press. He knew what it meant to have no home to return to. When she finished, she tried to stand again, heading for the hearth. Her steps wavered, but she reached the stool and lowered herself carefully. She held her hands toward the fire, letting the warmth seep in. Wade moved quietly, then took the axe outside to split wood. Each stroke rang steady through the clearing. He stacked the logs against the wall, mind circling the same truth he had brought her here, and now she was part of his life, whether he had planned for it or not. When he stepped back inside, she was examining the shelves, dark eyes passing over jars and sacks. She touched a jar of beans and looked at him. "You alone." "Yeah," he said simply. She pointed to herself, then to him. "Now too." The broken word struck deeper than he'd expected. He gave a slow, thoughtful nod. That evening, Ahyv Morning Star lay watching Wade cross, her eyes heavy but unflinching. At last her voice slipped out, soft and unexpected. "Why help me?" Wade set the knife aside and met her gaze. "Didn't want to see you die out there," he said simply. She studied him for a long heartbeat, as if weighing every word, then let her eyes drift shut. Her breathing steadied her body, easing deeper into rest. Wade leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire. He thought of the days ahead, of the dangers waiting in the timber, and of the cabin that no longer belonged only to him. The quiet inside had changed heavier now, but far from empty. He had crossed a line the moment he carried her through the door, and there was no way back. The next day carried a different edge. The visit from Rex Dugan, Boone Riker, and Jed Crowe still lingered. Not in splintered boards or spilled blood, but in the way both Wade and Ahyv Morning Star kept an ear tuned to every sound beyond the walls. At night, He kept his rifle within easy-reach boots, still on, listening for hoofbeats. By day, as he worked outside, he often caught her eyes sweeping the tree line, ready for trouble. Yet time pushed forward. The thaw crept deeper into the ground. Snowmelt trickled down the rocks in silver threads. Wade split wood, patched the corral fence, checked the roof for leaks. Each day he saw her watching, sometimes trying to follow, sometimes bracing herself at the doorway, as if testing her legs for more than the few steps she'd dared indoors. One morning, she tried for more. She reached the threshold, eased the door open, and stepped out her footing, unsure on the damp ground. Wade set down his axe, his gaze sharpening. She managed 2 steps before faltering. Before she could fall, his hand closed gently around her waist. She stiffened, breath catching, but didn't pull away. Her body leaned into him just enough for balance. Their eyes met close and steady, and in that quiet moment, the air held more than simple survival. He felt the warmth of her breath against the chill. She didn't look away. The weight of Chain's flight and rescue hung between them, but so did something unspoken and new. He let go slowly, steadying her upright. "Careful," he said in a low voice. A small nod, lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came. She dropped her gaze to the ground, took another tentative step, and then returned inside. Wade's chest tightened as he watched her go. He'd told himself she was only someone he'd saved, nothing more. Moments like this made that line harder to hold. Inside their days began to find a quiet rhythm. Wade showed her how to grind dried corn into meal. She touched the hand crank grinder and repeated corn until the word came clean. She boiled beans under his watchful eye, and when a bit of steam singed her hand, he caught her wrist and cooled it with water, noticing the steady way her eyes met his. Their talk grew from fragments. She pointed and he named. She repeated the words, rough at first, but sharper each day, table, fire, knife, water. He kept his replies brief, not from impatience, but from habit. She seemed to understand. And when she managed a word perfectly, a quick hidden smile flickered across her face. Not every silence was easy. One evening, as he mended a leather strap, she touched the fading rope marks on her wrist. "Men come back," she said. He looked up. Maybe she added voice breaking. "If come, you die too." Wade set the strap down and leaned forward, voice low, but certain. "If they come, they'll find I'm not easy to take down." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded, though the tension in her eyes remained. That night, as the fire burned low, he noticed her shifting beneath the quilt. The shirt he'd given her still draped her frame sleeves, rolled awkwardly. When the fabric slid across her shoulder, Wade turned away, jaw tight. Desire had no claim here. He would not let it define what they were building. But he couldn't deny the pull he felt, her quiet strength, the warmth she brought to the room. Next morning, he saddled a horse for the first time since she'd come. Supplies were running thin. He needed flour and salt. Standing in the doorway, rifle across his shoulder hat, pulled low, he told her, "Stay inside. Don't open for anyone but me." She stepped closer, voice barely above a whisper. "You back." "Always," he promised. When he returned late that afternoon with saddlebags full, he saw her through the window, sitting near the fire, the rifle resting within reach. She had kept watch. When he pushed the door open, her body eased. She didn't smile, but relief shone in her eyes. That night, over cornbread and beans, she surprised him, pointing at the rifle. "Teach me," she said slowly. He raised a brow. "You sure?" She nodded once. If men come, I not hide." Her words cut straight through him. She wasn't after bravado. She meant to stand beside him, not behind. He gave a slow, firm nod. Tomorrow. Later, as the fire dimmed, she whispered something in her own language, soft, no longer weighted with fear. Wade sat with boots off rifle across his knees and let the quiet settle. He knew then this was no longer just about keeping her alive until she could leave. The cabin had changed, and so had his days. Each glance, each touch at her waist pressed the truth closer. He didn't want her to leave at all. The morning after Ahyv Morning Star asked to learn, Wade stepped outside with a rifle slung low. Dawn washed the sky in pale gray, the chill sharp enough to turn every breath to frost. Wade Cross turned and found Ahyv Morning Star standing in the doorway, his shirt draped over her slim frame sleeves rolled to her elbows. Her face was tight with nerves, but steady as stone. He handed her the rifle. She gripped it a bit awkwardly. Small hands against the worn walnut stock. Wade stepped closer, nudging her feet into a wider stance and guiding her hands to the right place. She stiffened at the brush of his hand on her shoulder, but didn't pull away. "Keep it firm," he said low. Firm, she repeated, her accent rough but clear. They stood near the corral frost, crunching under their boots. Wade pointed toward a stump across the clearing. "Aim there." She raised the rifle, the barrel wavering. He stepped behind her, one hand steadying her elbow, the other pressing the stock snug to her shoulder. "Breathe. Slow." She exhaled and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the cold air, the bullet kicking up dirt well short of the stump. She flinched at the recoil, but held on. Wade gave a single approving nod. Again. She fired 3 more times. Each bullet missed, but her grip tightened and her stance steadied. After the 4th shot, she lowered the rifle chest, rising and falling hard. Wade eased it from her hands. "Not bad." She frowned a flash of frustration, then looked up at him. "Better tomorrow." A hint of a smile tugged at his mouth, though the hard lines of his face stayed set. "Yeah, tomorrow." By midday, the air carried a shift. Ahyv Morning Star was drawing water from the bucket when Wade froze, head snapping toward the ridge. Hoofbeats close. He moved fast, snatching the rifle and stepping onto the porch. She set the bucket down, eyes wide. "Them," she asked, voice low. "Inside," he said, sharper than before. She hesitated, then slipped back in, closing the door without a sound. 3 riders broke from the trees. Rex Dugan, Boone Riker, and Jed Crowe faces. Harder now, less easy than their first visit. They slowed at the edge of the clearing, eyes fixed on Wade, standing tall on the porch. The lead rider called out, "Been thinking. You sure you ain't seen her?" Wade's jaw tightened. "Told you before. Ain't seen anyone." The second rider leaned forward, voice carrying a cold edge. "Funny. Heard different in town word as you brought something back from the hills." So the trail had been noticed. Maybe someone had followed closer than he thought. Wade kept the rifle angled but not raised. "Town talk's too damn much." The third man spat in the dirt. "Listen, cowboy, she ain't yours to keep. She's property. Hand her over, and we ride on. Make it hard, it ends different." Behind Wade, a floorboard creaked. He knew Ahyv Morning Star stood near the door, listening. He didn't turn. "Don't think you boys got business here," Wade said flatly. The man with the rifle narrowed his eyes. "Maybe we do." The silence sharpened like a drawn blade. Wade's finger eased closer to the trigger, chest tight, but voice steady. "Then try it." For a long breath, nobody moved. Finally, the lead rider barked a strained laugh. "To hell with this. Ain't worth it." He wheeled his horse. The others followed, though their stares clung to the cabin. "You'll regret it," the second man called, as they vanished into the trees. Wade stood still until the hoofbeats faded, then lowered the rifle and exhaled a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He stepped back inside. Ahyv Morning Star waited near the bed, hands clutching the quilt's edge, face pale, but eyes steady. They know she whispered. "Yeah," he answered, setting the rifle by the wall, jaw set. "But they're not taking you." Her breath shivered, and for an instant she swayed. Wade stepped forward, steadying her with a hand on her arm. She froze, then slowly eased against his touch, her breathing evening out. That night the cabin felt smaller, the fire throwing restless shadows along the walls. Wade sat at the table, cleaning the rifle, every motion measured. She sat across from him, silent eyes following his hands. At last, she asked, "Why risk?" He looked at her a long time. "Because I said I would." She held his gaze, letting the words sink deep. Then for the first time she reached across the table, her hand resting near his, not touching, but close. He glanced at it, then at her face. She didn't move away. He left his hand where it lay close enough to feel the faint warmth of her skin. They sat like that, as the fire burned low, the wind sighing against the shutters. Wade knew his choice was already made. Those men might return, might bring more with them, but he would not hand her over. She was not leaving. Not while he still drew breath. The morning after the cabin itself seemed to breathe differently. Every creak of wood set Ahyv Morning Star on edge. Every rustle outside brought Wade's hand near the rifle. Yet neither spoke of it aloud. He worked through his chores, splitting wood, mending the corral, tending the horse. She stayed near, rarely stepping beyond the door. It wasn't only fear holding her close. They both knew Rex Dugan, Boone Riker, and Jed Crowe could ride back at any hour. By late morning, Wade brought the rifle outside again. Without a word, Ahyv Morning Star followed. Ahyv, Morning Star's eyes locked on the rifle, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Wade Cross handed it to her, and she gripped it with steadier hands than before. He corrected her stance, brushing her shoulders, and adjusting her elbows until everything lined up. She no longer flinched at his touch. "Breathe slow," he said. "Let the air settle before you pull." The shot cracked across the clearing. This time the bullet split bark from the stump. She gasped, startled, then turned to him, eyes wide. Wade gave a short nod. Better. Better, she echoed the word proud on her tongue. He let her fire 3 more rounds. Each struck closer to the mark. When the rifle grew heavy, he eased it from her grasp. She stood taller now, shoulders squared, a quiet pride shaping her face, something more than mere survival. Later inside, she worked the hand grinder with clumsy but determined strokes. Wade sat at the table mending tack, watching her pause and point at the grinder. "Work." "Same you," she said. "Yeah," he answered, voice low. A faint, true smile crossed her face. That evening after supper, she surprised him by gathering their dishes and rinsing them without a word. Wade sat near the fire, studying how she moved across the room, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. She still wore his shirt sleeves, rolled the hem falling unevenly across her thighs. For the first time, the cabin no longer felt like a place meant for one man alone. It looked lived in by 2. When she finished, she sat across from him at the hearth. The silence that stretched between them carried a new depth, not the wary quiet of strangers. She touched her chest lightly. "Ahyv Morning Star," she said. "I know. Wade replied, gray eyes steady. She shook her head, speaking again, voice catching. Ahyv, staked. He studied her jaw, working. That's up to you. She lowered her gaze, fingers twisting in her lap, then lifted her eyes again. I want. The words hung heavy. Wade's chest tightened. He had told himself time and again his duty was to protect, not to want. But her steady voice pierced through that wall. You want? She asked softly. His breath slowed, hands tightening on the chair arms. He could have denied it, buried it. He didn't. Yeah, he said, voice rough. The quiet that followed was thick with meaning. Her eyes searched his. Then she leaned forward, unhurried. Sure. Wade met her halfway. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and certain, the meeting of two souls who had endured too much, and yet still chose to stand. When they drew apart, her hand lingered on his chest, resting over the scar that ran along his collarbone. She traced it lightly, then looked into his eyes. Irk. Old, she said. Old, he confirmed. She pressed her palm against the scar, as if to mark it. He let her hand rest. Then she slipped back beneath the quilt, her face calm in the firelight. Wade stayed in his chair, staring at the flames, thoughts heavy. He hadn't touched another woman since Nora Boone's death, and hadn't thought he ever would. But this wasn't need or desperation. It was something deeper rooted in the choice to stay, to protect, to build a life side by side. When the fire sank low, he unrolled his bedding on the floor, rifle close at hand. Her breathing softened into sleep. Just before his own eyes closed, she whispered into the dark English, broken but clear. Not leave me. His reply came steady and sure. I won't. And for the first time in years, he knew the words were true. The days after their kiss carried a quiet change they didn't name. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter for two drifters. It began to look like a home, shaped by them both. Wade noticed first in small things, a thin strip of leather with beads she'd threaded now lay on the shelf, where he once kept only tools and tins. By the hearth, her comb rested beside the basin, left in plain sight. He thought of moving it, old habits of order, but left it. The place wasn't his alone anymore. Each day, Ahyv Morning Star grew stronger. Her stride steadied, and she began following him outdoors. She carried wood-fetched creek water, even tried hanging wash on the line. Her stitches were uneven when she mended cloth, but she worked with quiet pride. She was no longer merely surviving. She was reclaiming life. Their shared language deepened with work. She pointed to a broom, a kettle, a saddle strap, and asked for words in English. He gave them slow and clear, and she repeated until each one rang true. Sometimes she taught him soft words from her own tongue, sounds full of meaning he might never grasp, but he remembered them anyway. It wasn't just vocabulary. It was trust exchanged word by word. At night, when the fire dimmed low, she no longer pulled the quilt up like a shield. Instead, she let him sit beside her on the edge of the bed, their quiet breathing carrying the promise of a life they were beginning to build together. Their talks stayed brief, more glances than words, but the quiet between Wade Cross and Ahyv Morning Star no longer felt heavy. One evening, as she traced the scar along his collarbone, she whispered, "You're not alone now." The words struck deeper than she could know. For years, loneliness had been Wade's closest companion. In a single breath, she shattered it. Yet peace didn't erase danger. Wade knew Rex Dugan, Boone Riker, and Jed Crowe might ride back, unwilling to forget his defiance. Each morning he swept the tree line with sharp eyes. Each night he kept the rifle within reach. Sometimes he caught Ahyv Morning Star, watching him do it, face calm, eyes alert. She held no illusions of safety. She knew as he did that they faced the risk together. One crisp morning, he found her outside near the corral, rifle in hand, aiming at the same stump where she'd practiced before. Her stance was strong now. She breathed slow, squeezed the trigger, and a shot cracked through the clearing, splitting bark clean from the stump. Lowering the rifle, pride and resolve sharpened her face. "If they come, we fight," she said. He studied her for a long breath and nodded. "Yeah. We fight." Their bond deepened not through big speeches, but in the steady rhythm of shared work. When he saddled the horse, she brought the rope without a word. When she ground corn, he split wood close by. At night, her comb rested beside his knife, her beaded leather next to his whetstone. The cabin now carried both their lives. Their nearness grew as natural as the hearth's warmth. Sometimes her hand brushed his arm when she passed him at the table. Sometimes her shoulder pressed lightly against his while they stirred the pot together. These touches were no accidents. They were quiet choices. One blustery evening, wind rattling the shutters, they sat side by side on the bed. She met his eyes, dark and sure, and leaned in again. The kiss came deeper this time, searching and certain. His hand cupped her cheek, rough yet gentle. When they parted, she whispered, "Stay, always." "I will," he answered, voice low but firm. Later she lay against him beneath the quilt head on his shoulder, her breathing soft and even. He held her close, eyes on the fire. He had once believed his life had ended with Nora Boone's grave in Texas. But here beside a woman who had survived chains and abandonment, he felt something long buried belonging. The threat of those riders still hung over them, but the weight no longer crushed him. It felt like a danger they could meet side by side. For the first time since the war, Wade knew he had more to defend than his own life. The cabin was no longer just his. It was theirs. Whatever storm came next, he would stand his ground with her. Spring crept in. Snowmelt carved shallow streams through the slope, and the air smelled of wet pine and thawing earth. Days stretched longer, the light lingering past supper. Wade worked on the corral fence hammer ringing steady. When Ahyv Morning Star came with a bucket of water, she still wore the shirt he had given. Her sleeves rolled him loose, but she moved with new confidence. She set the bucket down, scanning the timber as he often did. The sound reached them together, hoofbeats close, not distant. Wade dropped the hammer and grabbed the rifle from the fence post. Ahyv Morning Star stiffened her hand, finding the small pistol he'd taught her to use. Their eyes met. No words were needed. 3 riders broke from the trees. Rex Dugan, Boone Riker, Jed Crowe, their coats darker with trail dust, their faces harder than before. They reined in at the clearing's edge, eyes cutting from corral to cabin to Wade, who stood ready with the rifle. "We gave you a chance," the leader barked. "You should have taken it." Wade's reply came flat and cold. "You're not taking her." The second man sneered. "She ain't yours. She don't belong here." Behind him, Ahyv Morning Star stepped forward, pistol low but steady. Her voice, though still halting in English, rang with iron. "I belong here." The men's eyes snapped toward her first surprise, then a flash of anger. The leader leaned forward in his saddle and sneered. "You think that cowboy can keep you? He'll die for nothing." Wade Cross tightened his grip on the rifle. His voice stayed low, each word carrying steel. Try me. The clearing fell silent, the kind of silence that snaps like a drawn wire. The leader jerked his chin at his men. One swung down from his horse hand, hovering over his revolver. Wade lifted the rifle in one smooth motion stance, unshaken. The man froze, mid-step, fingers stiff in the air. Beside him, Ahyv Morning Star stepped forward, raising her pistol with both hands exactly as Wade had taught her. Go, she said, voice sharp and clear. The leader's face twisted. For a heartbeat, Wade thought he might push it, but the stillness in the clearing held like iron. 2 against 3, and neither Wade nor Ahyv gave an inch. The man on foot spat into the dirt, muttered a curse, and climbed back into the saddle. The leader glared long at Wade. This ain't over. Wade's jaw clenched. It is if you ride out now. Another hard silence. Then the leader yanked his reins. The 3 riders, Rex, Dugan, Boone Riker, and Jed Crowe, turned and spurred their horses, vanishing into the trees. Wade kept the rifle trained until the sound of hooves faded. Only then did he lower it, breath easing from his chest. He turned to Ahyv Morning Star. She still held the pistol, hands trembling only now that the danger had passed, but her eyes remained steady. Wade stepped close, took the weapon gently, and set it aside. She looked up at him, breathing uneven, and whispered, "We fight together." "Yeah," he said, voice rough and certain. "Together." Back inside, the fire burned strong. Ahyv sat on the bed, hands resting on her knees, the weight of the encounter settling over her. Wade crouched in front of her, brushing his hand over hers, steady and warm. She didn't flinch. Instead, her fingers curled into his. "They'll not be back," he said. "You sure?" He met her eyes. "I'll make sure." She studied him, then nodded, the tightness in her shoulders loosening. That night, for the first time, Wade didn't sit guard in the chair by the door. He lay beside her on the bed, his arm wrapped around her, her head resting on his chest. Her breathing softened, sinking into sleep. In the hush, she whispered, "I stay with you always." He kissed the top of her head, his reply quiet and sure. "That's all I want." Days passed with no sound of hooves on the trail, no shouts cutting the trees, just the steady rhythm of 2 lives intertwined. Ahyv Morning Star's beaded leather hung on the shelf. Her comb lay beside Wade's knife. Her careful stitches mended his shirts. One morning, when she chased a stray chicken out of the cabin with a broom, Wade surprised himself with a short, quiet laugh. She answered with a smile that reached her eyes. By summer, the cabin felt transformed. Not in its logs or roof, but in the life pulsing inside 2 voices, 2 sets of hands, 2 shadows sharing the firelight. The silence that once echoed with memory now carried something stronger belonging. Wade had left home one frozen morning hunting game and instead brought back a woman broken by chains and abandonment. Months later, she was no longer only alive. She was his partner, his family, the love he'd thought he would never find again. The cabin was no longer his alone. It was theirs. And whatever the land, the seasons, or the world beyond the ridge might send their way, Wade Cross and Ahyv Morning Star would stand their ground together. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you